On today's show, we debate who will get the call to the Hall today and whether or not former Maple Leaf Curtis Joseph should be getting the old tap on the shoulder. All that more coming up on the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Leafs podcast, a daily Maple Leaf-centric podcast hosted by myself, Mike DiStefano, along with my co-host, Dave Morassutti. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, the sportsbook. It's the official sportsbook of the Locked On Network. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And I tell you, I wish there were odds on who was going to get into the Hall of Fame because I would have been betting a couple of guys pretty rigorously over the course of the last couple of days because there are some guys who I believe should be slam dunks, and one of which we will talk about today, David. We'll have a discussion whether or not, Curtis Joseph is a guy who should be getting the call to the Hall. As those who are unaware, today is the day that the NHL Hall of Fame, or the Hockey Hall of Fame, rather, not the NHL, it's the Hockey Hall of Fame, will be announcing the class of 2023. So there's been a lot of discourse and debate as to who should get the call to the Hall, and we figure it's what a better time for us to have that fun talk and debate than here on the Locked On Leafs podcast. So, there's some interesting first-time eligible guys. There's obviously holdovers from years past and a couple of former Maple Leafs that we want to talk a little bit about today. So why don't we start with just some of the first-time eligible Hall of Famers. To me, it's not the greatest class, Dave. I think outside of one name, I'm not sure there's many others that really there's going to be much of an argument to be first-time ballot members of the Hall of Fame. Some of the guys, Henrik Lundqvist, who to me is at the top of the list. Jay Bouwmeester is another guy. Corey Crawford is a player who's first-time eligible. Justin Williams, Mr. Game 7. Does that title alone get him some Hall of Fame consideration? That's one conversation that could be had. Mike Green's another one. But not really names that stick out to you as Hall of Fame worthy, maybe outside of Henrik Lundqvist, isn't it, Dave?
Yeah, it's like there's not one that really screams, like this is definitely a guy who should be a lock, right? When you're looking at these first time Hall of Fame eligible guys, we always think about guys who had illustrious careers through top to bottom. There's no, their resume is squeaky clean. You can't poke too many holes at it. I always hate this guy didn't win a cup, so he shouldn't be in the Hockey Hall of Fame. Because as you just mentioned, it's not the NHL Hall of Fame. It is the Hockey Hall of Fame, and a player's resume stretches beyond the NHL in a lot of ways.
Right. I am curious because everybody has their own criteria as to what they think goes into being a Hockey Hall of Famer or a member of the Hall of Fame. Is there anything that you like to see from a player that you consider to be Hall of Fame worthy at all when you're kind of, in your own mind debating if somebody should get into the Hall or not?
Well, I mean, a couple of things, right? I think of the era that they played in. How do they compare amongst their peers in that same era? Were they among the top of their peers? I something that always gets forgotten. Were they a trailblazer, or did they do something historical in that time too? And now that alone isn't enough, but these are just things that I'm listing off here.
Right.
Obviously accolades they had. You might not have won a Stanley Cup, but you may have won other trophies, other awards, right? Whether that's in the NHL, outside the NHL, Olympic, your international career. That's another big one there. So those are things that I look at beyond the Stanley Cup one. Because the Stanley Cup debate, in my opinion, is probably the worst one you can have. unless you're going with a guy that's won like 5-6 Stanley Cups, and like that makes that player, the candidacy, a little more legitimate than maybe other guys. But yeah, those are sort of the things I look at, beyond the stats, beyond beyond certain things. Like there are other things that make a player worthy of the Hall of Fame, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. Like I don't think it's all about points and cups. Obviously, those are very significant things when it comes to debating if someone is Hall of Fame worthy, especially more so points than it does Stanley Cups. But a big thing that I also believe should be in the conversation, and this is more so just the philosophy that I have about the Hall of Fame. Like to me, I look at it as kind of the museum of hockey, right? Like that's what it should be. And can you talk about a certain time period of the sport without acknowledging this player? Like did he make a name for himself as one of the top players in a couple year span? And to me, if you were able to do that, then I think you should be considered a Hall of Fame worthy player because you deserve to be remembered by the sport. And you couldn't write the record books. You couldn't write about the sport in that time without acknowledging player X as one of the top guys at his game at the time. Like that's one of the other things that I also do certainly look at. And there's a lot of guys that I think are certainly worthy of being in the Hall of Fame that are not in the Hall. Like we talked about the first time eligible guys and it not being a very strong class. Last year was a very strong class, so there wasn't a lot of the holdovers that got to get in. Like you had the Sedins end up getting in, and was Daniel Alfredson also a first time ballot guy last year? Or
I
maybe
believe so.
Luongo might have been the first time ballot guy last season. But there was a couple of guys who certainly it was a strong first ballot class, and you thought to yourself, it's going to be tough for some of those other guys who've been waiting and waiting and waiting to hear their names. I think this year is going to be different. I think at maybe Henrik Lundqvist ends up getting the call to the Hall as a first-time ballot guy. I don't see any of those others doing it. But then you look at some of the other names that have been holdovers for so many years. You think about Henrik Zetterberg, who was a terrific player back through the 2000s. It's tough to talk about, the 2000s without talking about the Detroit Red Wings, headlined by, Pavel Datsyuk and Henrik Zetterberg. So he's somebody who I think for sure should be considered as one of the guys in the next couple of years here in the Hall of Fame. Keith Tkachuk is always a name that comes up every year as one of the biggest snubs. At some point, you got to think he gets in there. Rod Brindamore is another name. But there's two other names who've been holdovers for the last couple of years that have not gotten the call to the Hall that you and I are going to discuss here on today's show. And it's two guys who, played for the Maple Leafs for a good stretch of time. And those two players are Curtis Joseph and Alexander Mogilny, two guys who I believe should get the call to the Hall later on today. On the other side, let's make our case for both of these guys, Curtis Joseph and Mogilny, as to why both of them deserve to be in the Hockey Hall of Fame. So we'll do that in just a moment. Before we get into it, though, let me tell you guys about one of today's show sponsors. It's our good friends over at FanDuel. Baseball season is in full swing. There's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets. If your first bet doesn't win, just go to FanDuel.com/locked-on today to join. They even got some NHL draft odds up where you can bet who's going to go second, third, fourth overall in the NHL draft. So don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Go to FanDuel.com/locked-on to sign up. FanDuel, official partner of the Locked On Network. Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast, a daily Maple Leaf-centric podcast. You can find it wherever you find your pods at, also up on YouTube. We have new shows coming out each and every weekday, Monday through Friday, all throughout the offseason. So make sure that you are locked into what we're saying, what we're doing here on Locked On Leafs to know the latest in Leafs Nation. And the latest today is, a former Maple Leaf in Curtis Joseph, and also we can throw Alex Mogilny into the fold, as those are two guys that I think should be Hall of Fame bound by end of day. And you and I, Dave, are going to kind of make the case for each of them. Shall we start with Curtis Joseph, Cujo, if you will?
Yeah, might as well. I will say I brought back the Cujo jersey just for this podcast.
See that? The one that fits like a 10-year-old Dave Morassutti, not the current Dave Morassutti.
Yeah, that was a 6-year-old Dave Morassutti's first ever NHL jersey. So yeah.
Awesome. Hey
It was
man,
epic.
that would have been Dave Morassutti. That would have been what the cup run or the when they went to the Eastern Conference Final that year, his
Yeah.
final season in Toronto it was. But yeah, man, I was a big time Cujo fan too. That Cujo's was like the first player that I became a fan of. So I have a special attachment to Curtis Joseph as well. So is that slight bias for why I think he should get into Hall of Fame? Maybe, but I think we could make a better, more compelling
Yeah.
argument. I'll let you start with some of the notes that you've compiled here about Cujo.
I mean, look, like Curtis Joseph, when people bring up his stats and where he kind of sat alongside other goalies of his era, he probably had arguably the toughest era of goaltenders to go up against. Dominic Hasek, no doubt, I think probably one of the more dominant goaltenders of all time.
Number one goalie all time.
Number one goalie of all time. Like pure dominance. Like you look back at his numbers, especially his days in Buffalo and like Chicago, it's ridiculous.
It's just stupid.
Patrick Waugh, all time lead win, like him for the longest time. Nobody thought we would ever see anyone catch Patrick Waugh with the wins. Obviously, then Martin Brodeur came along and did that. Even Felix Ed Belfour, the guy who ended up replacing Curtis Joseph in Toronto, like that era of goaltender. I don't think we'll ever have an era like that ever again. And the fact that Cujo was able to stand amongst that group, got himself into the Vezina Trophy candidate, into that conversation. Was it 5 times he was a finalist among the finalists?
Yeah, he never won the award, which some people look at and say, hey, maybe that's a slap in the face to Cujo, and maybe that's a reason like, oh, if he's never won the Vezina, how could he possibly be a Hall of Famer? Well, Dave just mentioned the crop of goaltenders that he was going up against every year. So he never won the award, but 5 times was a top 5 guy in the conversation for the Vezina. So that just shows, the consistency in which Curtis Joseph was considered a top 5 goaltender in the NHL year in and year out.
I think Dominic Hasek won the Vezina Trophy. Just doing my math here. I think he won it 6 times in 8 years.
Yeah.
When a guy's winning that many times, I'm sorry, you're gonna have a hard time winning it.
You throw Belfour in there, you throw Brodeur in there, you throw Patrick Waugh in there. Like there's just one guy has an incredible season, and you don't end up winning it. It's like Marc-Andre Fleury. He never won a Vezina. Did he end up winning a couple of years ago? That one season in Vegas. Did he end up winning that year, or was he runner-up? I can't even remember right now. But he's in the same situation that Cujo was in, where it's like you look at his career and it's like, wow, this is amazing. And then it's like, oh, he's never won a Vezina, although he may have won a couple of years ago.
He did win it in his
Vegas.
I think it was his last season in Vegas.
Yeah, so up until then, his Hall of Fame resume was always vacant of Vezina. He did end up winning it. Cujo never won, but man, the guy was just unbelievable. You look at the all-time list right now, he's 7th in wins with 454 wins, 7th all-time. It was quite outstanding. You look at 133 games in the playoffs, had 63 wins. Would you say that's the most wins of any goaltender who did not win a Stanley Cup in NHL history? So, yeah. And the reason why I think Stanley Cups is not necessarily indicative of what should go into, whether or not someone is Hall of Fame worthy is because realistically, Stanley Cups is such a team stat. Right? Just means that you're on a stacked team ultimately. Might be a little different for goalies because if you are good enough, a la Bobrovsky this year, you can lead your team to a potential Stanley Cup. But unfortunately, Cujo was never able to get the big one. Here's a stat that I thought was kind of wild, and I don't know if anybody are big fans of the point share stat that Hockey Reference has, but it's essentially like the NHL's version of WAR, wins above replacement, and goalie point shares is how many points the team gets in relation to what the goalie earns them essentially. So it's a goalie point share is a statistic. He's top 10 all time in goalie point shares. Would you like to know two current Hall of Famers that he's ahead of in this category?
I'm trying to. Is Brodeur one of them?
No, it's Ed Belfour and Dominic Hasek. He's ahead
Ooh.
of Ed Belfour and Dominic Hasek in goalie point shares. I mean, to me, I think it's almost a no-brainer that Cujo deserves to get in. I know that that Paul Paduti has been banging the drum for this guy, banging on the table for this guy for a couple of years now. At Adjusted Hockey on Twitter, if you're curious, he wrote a great piece about it on the Daily Faceoff as well. But he even was uncovering some wild stats where from the years of 1991 to 1994, he was the best goaltender in the NHL from those years, despite not winning a Vezina. Statistically, nobody had more goals saved above expected than Curtis Joseph in those years. It was incredible that he was never able to win a Vezina, but just the best goalie in the world. And like I said, is one of my criteria is were you one of the best at your position in a stretch of seasons? And for Cujo, that was from 1991 to 1994 in St. Louis. And for that reason, I think that you take all of what we talked about, you put that all together, it's a pretty good case for him to be considered a Hall of Famer. And hopefully he gets the call to the Hall later today.
And you got to think of the teams he played on too, right? Like he played for the St. Louis Blues, who weren't among the top, the top teams in the NHL at that point. Um, Even when he was in Toronto, right? When he went through those cup runs, Toronto didn't have the roster that Detroit had, Colorado, like there was some really tough competition that Cujo had to go through to even get his teams as far as they did. And I watched. I'm probably someone who has a very very vivid memory of watching Curtis Joseph in those playoff runs for Toronto, the multiple overtime games, the just the sheer consistency of his play, right? And obviously it still bothers me that they could not find a way to beat the Hurricanes, because I thought that year that they lost to the Hurricanes was probably one of their best chances of that.
Just
Like
another
that group.
reason. That's another reason why O-Dog. You always shake your head at the O-Dog, eh? For that with the
Yeah, we're gonna have to
Canadians.
have him on. I'm gonna have to give him a piece of my mind about that. Just ripping my heart out as a child.
No,
Him
I
and
love
Jeremy Roy.
Yeah, I grew to love the O-Dog. I grew to love him. But you're right. That was that was the closest that Curtis Joseph ever came to winning a Stanley Cup was, with the Maple Leafs that year. They should have beat Carolina. They were supposed to beat Carolina. Would they have beat Detroit? Probably not. They were a buzzsaw. To me, that Detroit team that year in 01-02, best hockey team ever assembled, in my opinion.
A team that could never ever be assembled in the modern NHL.
No. The salary cap will never allow a team to be that good ever again. But still, it was an incredibly impressive resume for Curtis Joseph. And hey, he also had that second tour of duty with Toronto really late in his career as well, which was kind of fun to see happen in the late 2000s. Ended up playing 21 games. They weren't spectacular. We'll say that. They were not very good when he came back, but it was still kind of fun to see him come back and finish his career as a Toronto Maple Leaf. And hopefully it'll be interesting when he goes into the Hall of Fame, if he goes in as a Maple Leaf or, what he decides to, I guess, associate himself with, because he didn't spend most of his time in Toronto. I guess he spent most of his career in St. Louis. He spent the most seasons with them, I would say. But for some reason, I feel like, Keswick, Ontario native, he came to Toronto
He's
and
still doing alumni work with the Leafs. Like
yeah,
everyone knows Curtis Joseph as a Leaf.
yeah. I mean, maybe we're a little biased because we're from Toronto, like we're in the area and we grew up
True.
Leaf fans watching him, but I know that Cujo loves being a former Maple Leaf. Like I've had the pleasure of being able to speak with him on Leafs lunch before, and he loves that he's a former goaltender. In the end, remember there was that one game this year where there was the thought that he was
Ugh.
like the e-bug or something. Could you
Yeah.
imagine if he would
Uh,
have played in that game? Would that have reset his Hall of Fame clock though?
I don't know if it changes when you're an emergency goaltender. Like I don't know
Yeah,
if your eligibility changes, but if that did happen, like my heart would not like my it just it would like I would have had a tear in my eye seeing
that
that.
would have been hilarious if
Oh
that did happen. He was not the e-bug. It
no,
was
he was not.
reported, but that was not true.
I
But
really do wonder if there's a rule against a former player being able to suit back up. I wonder if
yeah,
there
I
is
don't
that
know.
rule too.
I don't know. I used to always joke with Noodles a couple of times, Jamie McLennan, and said, "Hey man, you might get the call at some point." And he always says, "Yeah, well, I still have a suspension that I have to." He got suspended in his last game. I can't remember how many games, like maybe 2 games or something like that. He got a suspension, and then he just like retired and never ended up serving the suspension. So I think even if you want to be an e-bug, he'd have to serve a 2-game suspension before doing that. But yeah, Cujo, I think that certainly he's a guy who hopefully gets the call to the Hall later today. On the other side, we'll take one more quick break. Let's make the case for the other former Maple Leaf, and Alexander Mogilny. So we'll chat about him and whether or not he should be Hall of Fame bound later today. We'll do that on the other side. I'm Mike DiStefano with Dave Morassutti. You're listening to the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast. I'm Mike DiStefano. Got Dave Morassutti with me today. And just a reminder that this is a daily Maple Leaf centric podcast. You can find us wherever you find your podcasts at, also on YouTube. We please ask that you hit subscribe, leave a little comment down below. Do you think Cujo and Mogilny deserve to be Hall of Famers? Let us know your thoughts below and who else you think should be Hall of Fame worthy by the end of the day. Anyone who should get the call to the Hall, give us your list of names down below. Let's talk about Alex Mogilny and his odds at being a Hall of Famer by end of day. What do you think goes to support the case for Alex Mogilny, Dave?
I mean, when I talked to my criteria earlier, like I said, historical aspect of like his career, he was in a lot of ways a trailblazer. Yes, I understand he wasn't technically the first Russian player to come over to the NHL. There was that happened a little bit before him, but he set a trend where there were many players who, even though a Russian player did play in the NHL, many still didn't want to defect full time. Some had come back. He was one of the first to defect and stay. Right. So it was Mogilny and I think Fedorov came not too long after him. They were actually teammates at the time. So that alone, bringing in this wave of Russian players who, let's face it, like they changed the game in a lot of ways. The guys who did come over for Russia, like would we have eventually seen Alexander Ovechkin,
Malkin,
Malkin?
Malkin defected as an 18-year-old kid.
Yeah. Like how many guys would we have? Like, yeah, I always remember that Ovechkin didn't come over right away when he got drafted, right? Like there's so many players and I think a lockout also had something to do
Did
about
he?
that too. I think it was the lockout. That
Yeah,
was
yeah, it
he got
was,
drafted, then the lockout happened.
yeah.
But like it's something that we don't truly understand the historical impact that had because yeah, this guy came over from Russia. What's the big deal? It was a big deal. The way that they had to do it too, like Fedorov got I don't know if you ever heard the how Fedorov got here. He got a secret letter from a reporter in Detroit. The Red Wings said, "Can you give Fedorov this letter? Like sneak it to him in Finland," and he managed to do that. And then When the Soviet team was here, he found a way to sneak away and then get moved to Detroit. Like it's crazy what these guys had to do to realize this dream of playing in the NHL. So that's the first one there for me. Obviously, the 76 goals he scored. Like, yes, not as much as what Gretzky, Lemieux, or even Brett Hall, but he's right there in terms of greatest goal scoring seasons. And he did that in 77 games. Because everyone's talking about that year was the one that Solani did it as a rookie, but he did in 84 games.
Yeah.
Solani's in the Hall of Fame. And he obviously is deserving of that. But Mogilny, I think, was among one of the top Russian players of his era when he first joined the NHL. Finished 4th all time in Russian scoring in the NHL too. And he didn't play a whole lot, and he had injuries along the way too.
Yeah, I think that there's no doubt in my mind that at some point this guy's got to get in. I mean, he's had such a heavily decorated career. I'm trying to see where he ranks among goals all time in the NHL. I would imagine that it's pretty high, just based on the amount of goals that he scored throughout his career, like 473 goals throughout his career, nearly 500 goals. Like, there's not a lot of guys who played in the NHL who reached that numbers. So I'm just quickly seeing if I could pull this up and find the numbers here for him and where he's at. 473, 55. So he's 55th in terms of goals scored in the NHL. And above him, a lot of guys who are currently in the NHL Hall of Fame. A lot of guys below him also in the NHL, or in the Hockey Hall of Fame, rather. So I think certainly someone who scores that many goals should have his name called and should be in the Hall of Fame. Did you want to say something?
19th in goals per game among all NHLers. 19th in goals per game.
There you go.
And he had more than, I'm just looking at the list here, more than Pat LaFontaine, Joe Sakic, Luc Robitaille, Joe McGinley, Paul Kariya, Joe Nieuwendyk, Matt Sundin, Brendan Shanahan, Theo Fleury, Guy Lafleur. Like when I talk, like overall points can be a very deceiving stat. When you look at what his production is like throughout his career, even points, he had a better points per game than Sundin, LaFontaine, Lafleur, St. Louis, Peter Stastny, Alfredson, Dale Howardchuk, Ron Francis, and those.
There you go.
Like there's reasons, like you got, like I just don't know what more do we have. Like, do people need to realize with Gilney that he needs to get in there? I actually have more reasons too. That's the funny part. Is I have more reasons I could share.
Go ahead, go off, King.
All right, 2015, Fedorov was inducted into the Hall of Fame, and they asked him about Alexander Mogilny, fellow countryman. He deserves that honor. Alex was faster than all of us, and Alex was a machine. He was built like a machine. Plus, on top of all the crazy skill he had, he's better than all of us. He's amazing. And he was the first Russian player to be named a captain in the NHL.
That's true. He was captain with the Sabres. Yeah, with Buffalo. That's true. He was. I forgot about that. He was like a fifth round pick too.
He was 89th overall. And that's why he chose the number 89.
What a pick. What a pick by the Sabres back in the day to get Alex Mogilny. And he turned out a hell of a career, man. I mean, he did win a Stanley Cup. He does have a Stanley Cup on his resume too. Won it with the Devils back in 2000. 4-time All-Star. He won a Lady Byng award twice. Was he a second team all-right winger? He's got an Olympic gold medal, part of the Triple Gold Club, won an Olympic medal, a gold medal, a World Junior gold medal, and a World Championship gold medal to go along with a Stanley Cup as well. There's only a short list of guys who are on that list. So, yeah, there's a long list of reasons as to why Alex Mogilny not only deserves to be in the NHL, but should have already gotten the call to the Hall. I feel like it's been about 4 years in a row where, after the list of names get announced and everybody says, oh, this guy was snubbed, that guy was snubbed. Mogilny's always at the top of the list of snubs. So at some point, I think this is finally the year where, again, the first timers, not necessarily a strong group, this is when you can get some of those snubs into the fold here. I think Alex Mogilny should be up at the top of that list of guys who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, who currently are on the outside looking in. So, yeah, you don't got to twist my arm to make that argument, Dave. Do you have any more thoughts, a closing argument, if you will, about Alex Mogilny?
I mean, if you're comparing him with his peers that are already in the Hall of Fame, I don't know how you don't look at what McGillney did throughout his career. I guess he just didn't have the fame that a lot of the other guys did. And again, that to me speaks too much of it being a popularity vote than it is of getting the Hall of Fame worthy players in the Hockey Hall of Fame. So that's gonna be my final argument there.
Yep. So we'll see, man. We'll see later today. They make the decision. Will Curtis Joseph and Alex Mogilny get the call to the Hall? We shall find out. Do you have any prediction as to the guys who you think who are eligible, who get the call? There's usually about 5 NHLers. There's a female, and then like a builders category, coaching category. I mean, it sounds as though Carolyn Ouellette is pretty much a slam dunk almost to get it in the women's category. I mean, 4-time Olympic gold medalist through 20 years.
Megan Duggan is another one that should be able to.
Another one potentially who could, but Ouellette, like point per game player and at the Olympics and at the World Hockey Championships over the course of her 20-year career. So I think she's got a bit of an edge. I would think, maybe I'm wrong, but she's a name who for sure I think could potentially get into the Hall of Fame later today. If I had to guess, we've made our case for Cujo. We've made our case for Mogilny. I think that there's a strong case that Henrik Lundqvist could get in there as one of the first-time ballot winners, and potentially he could get there. He's among, some of the best in the NHL over the course of the last few seasons. He has more wins than Curtis Joseph. He's right ahead of him. Cujo, 7th in the all-time win list. Lundqvist, 6th on the all-time win list. No cup. But again, the beacon of consistency definitely should get him a call to the Hall. Keith Tkachuk is a name who consistently comes up as one of the bigger snubs. This might be the year to get Keith Tkachuk into the Hall, and maybe even a little Rod the Bod. Maybe you can get Rod the Bot into the into the Hockey Hall of Fame as well. He's someone who deserves an opportunity. Sergei Gonchar, Jeremy Roenick. I mean, do you got anyone who you feel strongly of that list who should potentially get the call to the Hall today, besides obviously Mogilny and Cujo, who we talked about?
Lundqvist is someone I think that should get in. I think just among if you're talking about first ballot guys, I think Henrik Zetterberg is another one that maybe should get some recognition too. I thought he was also on the Triple Club, won a Conn Smythe, Stanley Cup. The fact that he was 6th or 7th round pick by Detroit too. In those days, I think I would like to see Zetterberg get in too. Yeah,
he would definitely be somebody who would be very worthy of the honor if he got that phone call later today. Well, we were going to talk a little bit about what current Toronto Maple Leafs maybe are en route to a Hall of Fame career, but why don't we push that conversation to tomorrow, and we could also discuss who did get the call, who is in there, and then maybe we can start the new snub list for next season, because not all these guys we just talked about are going to get the call. Only 4 or 5 of them end up getting into the Hall of Fame every year. So somebody is going to have a problem with some of these guys, and we'll chat about some of the snubs tomorrow, and maybe take a look at some of the current Maple Leafs and see if anyone is pacing themselves to have a Hall of Fame career. So we'll do that on tomorrow's show. That'll do it for us here today on the podcast. I'd like to thank you so much for listening and supporting the show. You can subscribe to the Locked On Leafs podcast on all podcasts and platforms. Also up on YouTube. You'll receive daily Leafs content Monday through Friday. You can follow us on Twitter at Mickey_Canuck is me. At D_Morassutti is Dave. Follow the show as well at Locked On Leafs. Go ahead, leave a like on the video, subscribe, leave a comment down below. Who do you think is going to get the call to the Hall later today? We'll be back with another episode for y'all tomorrow. But until then, keep it locked right here on Locked On Leafs.